Thank you for talking to me. So much is happening right now. Before we get kind of into what we're really talking about here, tell me briefly a little bit about yourself. Tell me who you are and your area of expertise here, why we're talking to you about this today.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity to speak. And I am an associate professor of political science at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, and I am a specialist on Ukrainian politics and Eastern European politics and social mobilization. And I have been a visiting scholar several times at Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute.
Mm-hmm. I have to ask, are you Ukrainian?
Yes, I am. I grew up there and immigrated to the US at the age of 20.
Do you have family there?
I do.
How are you feeling?
It's much, I don't think I can convey in words of what I'm feeling. And I've been in contact with my family members who are all over Ukraine. Mm-hmm. Ukrainians seem to remain calm. There is understanding that the truth is behind them because this is an invasion, but there is a feeling of shock.
Mm-hmm. Well, first, before we go any further, my heart goes out to you and your family. I hope they continue to stay safe. I hope that this moves forward in a words can't convey either, but I hope you understand my sentiment there, that I appreciate you talking to me, especially given all of that. You know, shock is interesting because depending on who you talk to or how this is covered, for some people, this has been long awaited, much anticipated. We knew it was going to happen and it finally did. For others, they describe a sense of business as usual in Ukraine, a country that is kind of used to living in constant threat of attack from Russia in many ways. So is it fair to say that there have kind of been multiple storylines leading up to this?
I think both of them are correct. I think when I convey my own shock, or when I convey the shock of Ukrainians in Ukraine, shock does not mean surprise. So I think you're absolutely correct to point out that Ukraine has lived with it for 8 years, since 2014, with the first Russian invasion, with annexation of Crimea, with Russian troops being already in eastern Ukraine, and it's been reported by NATO, it's been reported by Russian opposition politicians, those who were alive at the time before they were killed by President Putin. This has been known, and with Russian troops and occasionally being in eastern Ukraine since 2014, and with massive Russian weaponry being in eastern Ukraine, and the war continuing as those forces in eastern Ukraine continued there was continued conflict between those forces that had Russian weaponry and occasional Russian troops and Ukrainian forces. And I've interviewed a number, so to clarify earlier, I've conducted and I'm finishing my book about the Ukrainian Revolution that took place in 2013, 2014. And that revolution was people standing up to authoritarian government that started cranking up on the repression and killing protesters that led to the mass revolution in the country. And that victory is what caused Russian aggression, because Putin cannot stand a successful democratic Ukraine.
Especially a successful democratic Ukraine that he sees as rightfully Russian.
That is the myth, right, that he was, right, there's nothing rightfully Russian, right? So he continues to promote these fables, at times contradictory, rewriting history, the most important thing, without even going on into this in many ways useless discourse with the Russian dictator, pointing out multiple points where he is absolutely wrong about that history, and Ukraine existing and Ukraine wanting to be independent for a very long time. But what is very important here is to remember the will of the Ukrainian people. Beginning, it was 1991 referendum of 92% Ukrainians supporting independence, and with continuing support since 2004, when Ukraine became a democracy, and then with standing up against authoritarian government who was a puppet of Putin, and then going back and reverting back to democracy in 2014. And that is the problem for Putin, as number one, and most importantly, he does not want an example of democracy. Now, Russians and Ukrainians are not the same thing. Ukraine has been a sovereign nation. Ukraine has been declared independence before it was part of the Soviet Union. But what is important here, again, I'm repeating myself, is the will of the Ukrainian people who want to be a sovereign, democratic country. And that what needs to be respected, rather than Putin's fable that denies. So it's very important to hear the nuances of his speech, right? At some point, he asserts that these nations are the same. And then at the next point, he denies Ukraine's sovereignty, right? He constantly denied over years. Throughout his presidency, he asserted that Ukraine is not a nation, that Ukrainians cannot lead themselves, that they're the puppet of the West. None of that is true, but that is the falsehood that he's promoting, asserting superiority of Ukraine and asserting his claimed right to rule Ukraine, because supposedly, according to him, Ukrainians cannot rule themselves.
Contradictory messages there, indeed. This message from Putin that seemed to directly precede the first sounds of the attack. Around the world, you could hear it on cable news as it started happening almost in real time. He referred to this Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian people is almost needing Russian protection. The idea that the Russian people had to step in and own up to this little brother in Ukraine in some ways. It was a message, of course, to his people in Russia to get them on board with this. It's a message that we all heard. And he also referred to the Ukrainian government as neo-Nazis and fascists. Your response to that, is there anything that's happened that's made that there's a kernel of truth into what Putin is saying that he is seizing onto, or is that completely fabricated in your perspective as an expert on the politics in Ukraine?
Thank you. Excellent question. And you're right to point out that is what he said. And yes, it is completely fabricated, because again, Ukraine is a democracy since 2004. And after the revolution, against an authoritarian, against a leader who came to power through democratic means, but then started implementing repression, there was throughout the winter of 2013 and 2014, the state, and that is the book that I worked on, the research that I worked over the years, interviewing hundreds of revolutionaries, right? And we can, there is a clear record of the state aggression against the people, of using torture against people who were standing up against the government, using authoritarian measures, using kidnapping, humiliation, and then eventually live ammunition and snipers. Many of the revolutionaries that I interviewed, that a consul of Europe interviewed, there was even at that time, there were signs that those aiding the Ukrainian president were the security forces from Russia. Some suspected that the snipers that were used against protesters were from Russia. There is still no evidence for that, but what we have very clear evidence is the aggression against the people of Ukraine was committed by the Ukrainian government in the winter of 2013-14, and people stood up with knowing risks to their life to fight for freedom, to fight for democracy. And that was clear with like over 100 people that I interviewed who participated in the revolution, and in multiple other sources. That was the idea. And you need to see that that was the beginning of very clear Russian aggression. After the first Ukrainian revolution, after the beginning of Ukrainian the Orange Revolution in 2004, when Ukraine started chose democracy and started choosing more ties with the West, that was the sign of first Russian aggression, trade, economic pressure with gas prices, pressure on oligarchs, and etc. But after 2014, when it was a very clear picture that Ukraine now is a democracy, and that is a problem for two reasons for Putin. One, it's a bad example for people of Russia. That means they might push, once they see successful democratic Ukraine, they might push against Putin. And secondly, that means he cannot control Ukraine. And we can see clearly throughout his speeches, his very clear ultra-nationalistic message of him stating his superiority over Ukraine. So that is the key, and here to conclude, that is the key, is that Russia acts as imperialist based on ultranationalist ideology and the claim of superiority, and attacking Ukraine by claiming what has been done over years now by Russian media is the claim that Russian speakers or ethnic Russians are somehow hurt in Ukraine. Nothing can be further away from the truth. Ethnic Russians and Russian speakers lived in a democratic Ukraine that was infinitely much freer than Russia. So.
All of that being said, I so appreciate your perspective, not just as, Ukrainian-born woman living here in the United States now, but also, of course, all this research leading back years with all of this. Even it sounds like, and correct me if I'm mischaracterizing this, but it sounds like in many ways, despite Ukraine's status as a sovereign nation, at the very least since the revolution less than 10 years ago here, living next door to a big neighbor like Russia, and with a leader like Putin who has this aggression, it's not something new. Even before this current crisis, how did just Russian influence or threats just kind of impact politics and day-to-day life in Ukraine? Going back to that idea that for so many people, they were shocked but not surprised because they're just kind of used to this constant Russian bullying of the country.
Absolutely. So if you can restate the core of your question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Just the extent to which, how has Russia's impact on Ukraine been even before this current crisis? After they're a sovereign nation, after Crimea and everything like that, just even in the past few years leading up to this point, what's it been like?
Absolutely. Great question. And of course, it calls for several books, just that question, right? So yes, Ukraine has been sovereign since 1991. The borders were agreed on. Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world in exchange for UK, US, and Russia guaranteeing, providing security assurances to Ukraine. So at first, when Ukraine became independent in 1991, there was a feeling of relief and because you need to remember, even when Ukraine became was part of the Soviet Union, there were massive atrocities, including Holodomor, that was committed by Stalin in Ukraine, but lots of people did not know that that was happening. And with the accident that took place of Chernobyl and the failure of the Soviet authorities of dealing with that and saving and evacuating people, that brought awakening to the people of Ukraine, who many of them were under the influence of the Soviet propaganda. So with the 1991, there was a feeling of relief. Of course, it was very painful transition from the Soviet state economy, from Soviet totalitarianism. And for a few years, while Ukraine was sovereign, it still dealt with authoritarianism. And what you see, it's not only in Ukraine. Ukrainian authoritarian leaders, while they would push back to Russia, if there was when they were being questioned more by the public, then they would turn to Russian autocracy. That is the same what just happened in Belarus. Where the current president is illegitimate because there was an overwhelming protest all over the country, and especially in the capital of Belarus. They were forcefully suppressed. Unlike in Ukraine, they didn't succeed. And now Lukashenko, who was previously critical of President Putin, now he turned to support Putin's aggression. But I apologize, I regress a little bit from your question. So there was a change. It's hard to explain what happened in the past 30 years since Ukrainian independence, right? So at first, while Ukraine announced independence from Russia, there was continuing feeling of camaraderie. The whole economy was tied into Russia. People were traveling, there were relatives. With 2004, the relations became tense because of the beginning propaganda in Russia that pro-West means anti-Russia. That was not true, right? Any public poll you look at in Ukraine, Ukrainians were, majority of them were against NATO, majority of them were did not want to join European Union, or they wanted to continue to have friendly ties with Europe and with Russia. But as they pushed back and against authoritarian government in 2004, and then against the attempts of the Ukrainian government in 2014 to push against authoritarian government, Russian propaganda intensified, spreading complete falsehoods about the revolution, about the causes of the revolution. And that started, you have to keep in mind, lots of people in Ukraine have relatives in Russia. And many of them in the interviews told me of the shock they experienced when they talk to their relatives in Russia, who tell them that they know much better what's going on in Ukraine, while they're saying, no, I'm in the center of Kiev. This is what we're doing. This is why we are doing it. We're fighting against the authoritarian regime. And in fact, there was a very big banner in Ukraine during the revolution that said, we hate Putin, we love Russians, but hate Putin. And half of the people I interviewed spoke Russian. Some of the people I interviewed came from Russia to support the cause of the Ukrainian revolution. So the feeling is hard to describe, because Ukrainians want peace, Ukrainians want democracy, Ukrainians want freedom, and they want a successful economy. But again, as that peace and democracy presents threat to the Russian government, to Putin himself, he starts spreading the fault. It was very carefully designed Russian propaganda to undermine the trust of the Russian people against their own close family members in Ukraine. And that caused pain in Ukraine because they felt betrayed by their own friends, by their own relatives. And it was hard for them to be that misunderstood, to be that misinterpreted.
You know, one thing, this is less of a expertise question and just more of a something I've been kind of wondering as I follow along with this. And once again, if I'm ever misstating something, please correct me here. But, you know, of course, the narrative, you could say, is that Putin sees Western leaning Ukraine as a threat to him for multiple reasons, one of which, though, would be a NATO alliance. So not even just the soft values of democracy, but the idea of having NATO troops in a NATO stronghold in Ukraine. But Ukraine's not a member of NATO. Had they recently tried to join NATO, or had there been any kind of move toward that to provoke any of this?
No. So your question is brilliant here. Is to look at the timeline. Has something changed? Ukraine was considered to be part of NATO. What is interesting, again, before 2014, before the Russian invasion, majority of people in Ukraine were against joining NATO. That talks about possibility, and it's only possibility. It has been discussed before, but there was more support of NATO membership in Ukraine, witnessing Russian aggression, witnessing Russian annexation of Ukraine's territory and its aggression in eastern Ukraine. But that has not changed at all. And you're right to ask that question. Ukraine's membership did not, they did not gain membership. They did not had a change of status. It's always just been a discussion. So you're right to point out that that remains constant, and that helps us see that NATO membership or potential Ukraine's membership. And it was very clear that while this was potentially in the talks, the Western countries are so scared of Russia that it was an understood consensus that nobody was offering membership to NATO. Whether majority of Ukrainians would want that for their own security. Now you see why they started wanting, because they started waking up to the idea that Russian aggression will only increase in their lives. Today, there were, as the attacks mostly in the military, there were already civilians who died. But that did not change. Most importantly, NATO, and it was understood by NATO and by Russia that NATO is not a threat. Because, so first of all, it was not the West who pushed the expansion. It was not US who forced those countries to join. Poland, Baltic republics, they asked to be to join NATO as soon as they were freed from the Soviet control. They were not part of the Soviet Union, but they were controlled, and a totalitarian regime was imposed on them for decades. And in the 1990s, they wanted to join as a security assurance for their own lives, to protect themselves from Russia. And another very interesting element here is that if NATO wanted to attack Russia, they have NATO troops in Baltic countries that are bordering Russia. If they wanted to do anything, they wouldn't need to have NATO in Ukraine. It is that simple. NATO is stronger than Russia. If they would have wanted to do anything, they didn't need Ukrainian membership. Right. So that is a complete, again, your question really helps to see the truth of that fable behind that is completely fabricated. But that Putin's message was very effective. And in fact, just a couple of years, over 60% of Russians believed that US can invade them any day. Now you tell me, was US planning to invade Russia?
Not that I know of.
Nobody cared.
Mhm.
Nobody was interested in that war. It was
Mm.
more than a fable, right? And Russian government obviously knew about it,
Yeah.
but they created this false fear to make Russian people continually support Putin, who was presented by the state-controlled media as the savior of Russia from the evil West, who control, and they keep repeating that Ukraine is just a puppet regime of the West. And so the technique is the same as in totalitarian regime, which shows us that Russia effectively turned into totalitarian regime um, um, through its message of superiority and through its message of presenting the Russian government as the savior from the threat that doesn't exist.
Hmm. Hmm. There are so many people here who, some folks have been paying attention to this for a while. Other folks are turning on their morning news and seeing the potential of World War III is what everybody is saying about it. But of course, your home country is ground, I don't want to say ground zero, but that's where this is the center of all of this. The center of this universe is Ukraine right now. What do you think people, especially here in the Midwest, whether it's individuals, lawmakers, other stakeholders, what do you want people to know about Ukraine right now that you think they might not?
Thank you. What a wonderful question. There are a couple of things. One, I think that we need to be very open at and call, and Putin declared war on Ukraine. Putin invaded Ukraine before in 2014, but now he openly declared war. So we shouldn't call it a Ukraine crisis, as I often hear it being referred to, because it's a very misleading term that aids Russian aggression, essentially. We need to call it what it is. It's Russian invasion of Ukraine. Secondly, we need to remember that it's Russian invasion of democratic, sovereign Ukraine. The population of Ukraine is 43 million people. It's, if you don't take into account, after Russia, it's the largest country in Europe. People admire Americans for their love of freedom. And so they look to the West as an example of democracy. Ukrainians wanted to be their own sovereign country, their own democracy, but they were looking toward the West as an inspiring example of democracy after years of totalitarian Soviet Union. And the third one, so invasion of democratic Ukraine, and that is something that needs to be remembered. Learn more about Ukraine. What I noticed a lot of confusion, because due to the Soviet propaganda, very little is known about Ukraine, about its amazing culture. And you see right now, it shows the image of Kiev, the center of Ukraine. Its beauty, its culture, its architectural sites, its fascinating history. So I encourage you to learn more about Ukraine, to learn more about the fight for the freedom, and against all odds for years against the Russian pressure. So that would be, and if you know any Ukrainian, reach out to them. Reach out with a simple text, because those many friends who reached out to me, maybe it is an amazing and a very important message. While you might feel that it's so little, it's very important to show moral support to the people of Ukraine or any of those who of Ukrainian diaspora who right now in the US. And finally, as you learn more and see the real picture of what's happening, call your representatives, and Ukrainian government is asking for more help with military, with air defenses. They're asking for air defenses against the assault that is continuing. And today, so much were major airports were destroyed in Ukraine. All the there were so many targets that were destroyed in the matter of hours. And Ukrainian government is asking for air defense system. They're asking to have at least some help with being defended. US sanctions are an attempt that we're doing something, or it's a story that we're doing something. What needs to be remembered, the sanctions that are declared so far, even those who are possibly are going to be, they will change Russia's GDP, maybe they will lower it maybe for 2%. In other words,
it sounds kind of too like what we're saying about it. It's, you know, it's not Ukrainian people versus Russian people. Ukrainian people know and love people of Russia as well. And so, you know, we're talking about, even on the global scale, some of these sanctions aren't going to impact Putin. They're going to impact
That is absolutely right. There, of course, there has been, especially with the open invasion, there are lots of people in Russia, and maybe I wasn't clear about that. At least half of the population are behind Putin because they believe the message, or because, as many scholars pointed out, in Russia there is identity crisis. They're a former empire, and every single country that has been a former empire has the identity crisis, and it becomes part of their personal, they're more likely to support imperialistic tendency of the current country because they were used to tie in their personal identity with the global power. So that is important to remember. But yes, if we want to change, you absolutely correctly pointed out, that will not affect Putin. That they have a war chest of 600 billion, I believe, what was being reported. Even the Russian economy is not going to be affected by more than just a few percent. But even if they did, even if it affected the Russian economy of 20%, it will not affect Putin himself. And he keeps feeding on the war. And while many in Russia are against it, quite a few people are supporting it. Russia is split with that. And also information, I checked even the messages, the Russian media that remained in the opposition. Even they are very restricted. Those who called for protests in Russia already have been arrested today. So that message of control throughout these 8 years, if you post a Facebook, some people were being put in prison for just a Facebook post in support of Ukraine.
Wow.
We need to understand how repressive Russian regime, and it's targeting any support for Ukraine. So there's fear against the Russian population, even among those who support Ukraine and are against war. So he managed during these 8 years to kill off, poison his opposition. So he's been preparing for this for quite a while, of crushing domestic opposition, setting up domestic institutions that are meant to suppress. And he is ready. So yes, you're absolutely right. The sanctions, if even if they affect Russian people by a little bit, that will not make a difference, and it will certainly not affect the luxury style of the Russian president, who feeds on the lies that then create wars. And today he started destruction of entire country.
I can't imagine that this is the last time that I'm going to reach out to you, or somebody's going to reach out to you for your expertise on all of this. It'd be wonderful if it just went away, but I imagine that's not going to be the case. And you literally can write books about this. I could talk to you about it all afternoon. I think your perspective is so fascinating, but for time's sake, just to kind of wrap up here, as we're looking toward what's happening there right now, and things have changed so quickly, what are you telling your friends and family in Ukraine right now from your perspective here, not only just in the United States, but frankly, sometimes there will be an expert on politics, and even if you live thousands of miles away, you might understand the situation a little more deeply than the people who are living there. So what are you telling your friends and family right now who are in your home country?
We try to stay positive, but unfortunately, there's not much knowledge of everything that I know. That and in many ways, the story is quite simple, right? It's not complex. Ukraine's democracy is a threat to the existence of the Russian government as it sits today, and it lies and it creates fear among the Russian population, and then they set out for a destructive war. It's I'll tell you, in the words of the Ukrainian president, years ago, when I was watching his interview, he was asked, "You're about to meet with the global leaders about the situation, about the attempt of finding a solution. Are you afraid? Are you worried?" He said, "No, I'm not afraid or worried, because I know that truth is with us. I know we're on the right side of history." And I think that is the message that when I talk to some of the relatives, there's shock, there's attempts. So lots of people now are heading to the borders, because in many ways, maybe because of those connections to people in Russia, there was still hope. Maybe Russians will understand. Maybe Russians will listen to us. Russian speakers in Ukraine, who will tell them all of this is a complete lie. And so there was continuous hope because of those ties. But as that hope is disappearing, the calm that you still see in the streets of Ukraine is that they know they're on the right side of history. They know they did everything they could to offer the best future for their children through making sure they have a democratic country. And that is my idealistic hope that helps me keep going. And that's what we tell each other, what Ukrainians tell each other, is that the good will prevail.
Again, I feel like I could talk to you about this all afternoon, but we don't have that time, and I don't want you to be stuck in that headspace for too long. And so I appreciate you. I appreciate you sharing your perspective. Again, all of my best to your loved ones, to you and to your loved ones, as all of this unfolds. I can't imagine. I think that your perspective will really help illuminate a lot of things for our viewers. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and thank you for your excellent questions. And most importantly, thank you that you care.
Absolutely. All right. I'm sure we'll be in touch.